morning, everybody. I always think it's great to be first up on day 2 of an event like this, when everybody has had a full day of really stimulating conversation and dinners and receptions and the after party that I was in bed for, and hopefully all of you guys had a good time. But I'm joking. If there was an after party, tell me about it later. But you all look really fresh-eyed and ready for more, and we will not disappoint. So we're kicking off day 2 of the summit, really taking a lot of the dialogue that we had yesterday, building on minerals and securing supply chains, and now really starting to drill down into one of the primary end uses of these critical minerals, which is the transportation sector, and looking at electrification, kicking off with a phenomenal panel that will talk about how we go from early first movers to mass adoption of EVs. And we have a fantastic cross-section of people from industry and policy here with us today. So why don't I'll just announce all of our panelists and ask them to take their seats. Starting with, we have unfortunately, Megan Lee from Panasonic was not able to join us, but we are very fortunate to have Megan Pollock, Vice President of Branding and Strategic Communications for Panasonic North America.
Good morning, thank you.
Thank you. We're also really fortunate to have with us Duncan McIntyre, who is CEO of Highland Electric Fleets. And finally, I know he needs no introduction to an audience like this, but we have Gabe Klein, Executive Director of the Joint Office on Energy and Transportation. So thanks again to our esteemed panelists for joining us. I'm not going to do any more introduction than what I already did. I think over the course of the next 45 minutes, you'll really learn a lot more about the pivotal roles that each of these panelists is playing in accelerating electrification in the on-road transportation sector. So rather than do any further introduction, I think I'll just launch into the first question, if you guys are okay with that.
Great.
So building on yesterday's dialogue, I was thinking I would start with Megan and Duncan and ask about how companies are rethinking their supply chains in light of changes in federal policy like the Inflation Reduction Act and Build Back Better.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to kick it off. Thank you all for coming today. Really exciting conversation and excited to be here with you all. For Panasonic, we didn't have to rethink much, which is really exciting. We are heading in this direction. I think we are going in a really fantastic direction. We are thrilled with the IRA. We think that will help accelerate everything that we're all looking for. But Panasonic's been invested in North America. We've had an EV battery manufacturing facility in Reno. We opened one in 2015, and just last year we announced a new facility coming to Kansas. So we are moving in that direction, and we've really begun to move our supply chain. It takes time, and it takes support from the federal government, like in the IRA, to ensure that can happen. But we've started building these partnerships with groups like Redwood Materials, and we're finding those to be very successful, but critical so that we really can make the most of what we're doing here in North America. So, we are doubling down on what we're already doing, and we think the IRA is going to be critical to ensure that we and our partners can continue to see that sort of growth in North America.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think the questions about supply chain, if you think about the world pre-infrastructure bill, pre-IRA, there was a perspective that I think industry had about the growth in light duty, medium duty, heavy duty electrification, and that perspective has been turbocharged with the cash on the hood that is a function of these programs. And what that's done is it's caused manufacturers from companies like Panasonic all the way to companies like Daimler to have to rethink how they effectively get enough production, enough throughput. And so we're in a world where there's actually a supply and demand imbalance. It's tough to get product. You used to be able to get a garbage truck or a school bus or a street sweeper in 3 months or 6 months, and now you're waiting 12 months, 15 months. So just to come full circle, your question about supply chain, we're buying a lot more stuff today for projects that we don't have under contract yet. And so we're effectively getting into the queue to manage the supply of equipment, and that's doing two things. I think the first is it's giving us more comfort we can deliver for cities that want to electrify. And the second thing is it's giving the manufacturers more comfort that they have orders to build an extra line, add an extra shift, invest more heavily in their products and services. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's really great to hear that companies are willing to take on a little bit of risk in terms of managing more inventory for the purposes of being able to deliver faster for your customers. Gabe, I was hoping that maybe you could add some perspective as it relates to the all-of-government approach. So what we're seeing from your office is the rollout of programs and funding opportunities at a very fast pace, at least fast for government, and having worked for the government, I feel like I could say that. But the fact of the matter is, the IPCC report that was released last week is really underscoring the fact that whatever sense of urgency we've been feeling, we really need to double down. And how is it that we can, with this whole of government approach, accelerate action? And what are the levers that you're really focused on in your role to provide that catalyzing environment for a lot of the companies that are here?
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad you put that broad perspective out there, because before I got here, I wrote a book, I spoke a lot, and the thing I would try to get across to people is around 2015, 16, 17, is that we've been on the planet for a couple 100,000 years, in this form for tens of thousands of years, and yet it's the last 100 or so that we've really sort of damaged the environment at this level. And so that's why there's such a hockey stick, because we're also increasing population. We were at 2 billion people in 1900. We're at 7-point-something billion. We're heading towards 9 billion by 2050. So consumption of fossil fuels at a certain level is not sustainable. Our office was started as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we were funded with $300 million. There's, as people know, there's $7.5 billion of funding, and there's the $5 billion NEVI program, the $2.5 billion CFI program, which just got released. There's the $5 billion EPA school bus program. There's a $5.6 billion transit program. So we are here to support all of that. And to your point, the Biden administration very much wants to break down the silos within government to focus on the outcomes for real people and to work as fast as humanly possible on the climate problem, but also to develop a really amazing and diverse workforce. Like, my old boss, Rahm Emanuel, was like, don't ever let a good crisis go to waste, which is maybe a controversial statement. But I think what he meant by that was, there are going to be big challenges, right, and big problems, but those are also opportunities. And we have this opportunity to create the workforce for the 21st century in the right way so that everybody has a shot at it, and to build capacity in the United States. So to Duncan's point, there are these supply chain issues that started a few years ago. Transportation is one of the biggest issues. Getting things over from Asia can take months now. And so the ability to build things here, and that's why the Buy America standards that were just released are important, because I think they were able to address both issues, timeliness and workforce, in a very smart way. But anyway, to close, I'll just say that we're here to accelerate what the private sector is trying to do and to support states, cities, MPOs, towns, Indian tribes, and companies to come together to figure out how to implement this responsibly, how to integrate planning, for instance, how to write contracts in such a way that you get the best value, not just the lowest price, right? And I would just encourage people to go to driveelectric.gov because there's so many resources there and links to resources that I will not have time to go into today.
Well, thanks, Gabe. And shameless plug for the work at the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. We are very focused on decarbonization of ocean freight. So we definitely need to manufacture things domestically, but at the same time, really look at the hard-to-abate sectors of transportation and to decarbonize those. That being said, I was hoping that we could maybe dive into one of the things that you pointed out, Gabe, which is, facts on the ground. In terms of implementing some of these projects, you can support companies, but there really needs to be an ecosystem that is developed that doesn't really exist today. So whether it's workforce and having the workforce that can build, operate, and maintain some of these newer vehicles and technologies, but then also in terms of deploying the alternate charging infrastructure, in this case, alternate fueling infrastructure, rather in this case, EV charging infrastructure. And I was hoping that maybe we could start with you, Duncan, in terms of what gap do you think what is the execution gap between this policy and actually building these projects in the wild with counterparties like states or local governments that don't necessarily have the expertise, but also really don't have the capital to deploy to install some of this stuff?
Sure. I think when you're talking about transportation, you're largely talking about sort of hyper-local, management teams and operations. And so we've found that every state, and then within states, there are clusters that tend to glom together and support each other. In states that don't have meaningful demonstrations of electrification projects, it's really hard because everyone feels like they're the first. So there's a tremendous need for more mass market education. We are flying people from all over the country to Bethesda, Maryland, because we have a massive electrified school bus project there. And so they get visitors almost weekly, just trying to kick the tires and get comfortable that we can train our mechanics on how to work on the tech. It's going to be reliable. It's going to meet the duty cycles. And so I think getting those really good local proof points in every state is critical, and then building a durable ecosystem that can expand from there. And that ecosystem includes, workforce development. It includes, good education, creating connective tissue between federal policies and what has to happen on the ground locally for a project to be successful. And we, as a company, try to span that, those 2 points, but today they're very far apart. And getting, a fleet of 1,500 garbage trucks to pick up garbage in the morning is really hard. And the furthest thing from those operators' minds is, how do we install electrical conduit and get comfortable with battery technology? And so bridging that gap just takes a real local touch.
Thank you. So Megan, what does it look like a little bit further upstream, and how are you supporting your customers?
Yeah, so we think a lot about workforce. And we've been doing this again for years now in the US, and workforce is critical. It's one of the big pieces that we thought about when we were moving into Kansas. We went, just as Duncan's saying, we went and talked to, do we have the local government support? Do we have the universities, the community colleges? Our first partnership there was with a lower level school because it can start there. And so making sure that that infrastructure was in place, and we can't do it by ourselves. We need that partnership. And so that was one of the big reasons that we felt comfortable moving into Kansas, is we had that partnership, we had the education on the ground. But I will say we've also done this in Nevada. We're working with community colleges, just built out an advanced training center that has 400 folks on-site training. One of the things that we've seen in Nevada as well is this is a constantly evolving industry. And so learning to do something once, I mean, you hear about all the new batteries, and so we're constantly making new and different batteries. So we recently turned over the first line in Nevada to be a training line, so that folks coming in receive on-site training, and then folks who are already there can go back and continue to be trained so that we can keep our best employees, our smart employees, and make sure that they're staying up. That's critical for us to do. We can't leave anyone behind in this. And this technology is going to continue to change really quickly. And so we're trying to build, both locally and within our own facilities, a really strong training infrastructure. That's the only way we're going to be able to keep up with this really quickly moving industry.
You bring up great points in the sense that the technology is evolving so rapidly.
Yes.
So all of the work that needs to be done to upskill the workforce really has to, it's almost a continuous cycle of training at this point, which is a great approach. Gabe, I was wondering, so a lot of the policy focus is on building out charging corridors, and whether it's the NEVI program or other policies that are getting rolled out, we rightly need to look at, well, how can we give more confidence to whether it's a private vehicle owner or even in some cases for fleets that they will have charging where they need it. But of course, doing that in a really constrained environment, whether it was the minerals that we heard about yesterday and availability of those to really build out the charging infrastructure, but make the necessary electrical upgrades that we know the system needs to be able to provide orders of magnitude more power and hopefully clean power than we have today. What in your role have you seen as, now that the policies are out there, how might they need to be adapted so that these really ambitious goals could be achieved? And are you noticing that from a technical assistance perspective, which I know is a big focus of your office, what are these states and communities really needing in terms of getting them there so they could take advantage of the funding?
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there. But it's a great question. As Duncan said, everything is sort of local, right? And so people are living where they live on the ground. And a lot of what we've been trying to do is to bridge the benchmark and sharing gap across the country and even with other countries. We were on with the EU yesterday, talking to them about various issues. There's a tremendous amount we can learn from countries overseas. They can learn from us. I think from a technology standpoint, we're often way ahead. From an implementation standpoint, sometimes we can learn from other countries in particular. I think I've been really excited coming from the transportation side more than the energy side into this job to see how excited the utilities are actually about this and the regulators and so forth. I think that
Slow growth.
Yeah,
Slow growth.
yeah, but they are. I mean, they're starting to see this opportunity for a widely distributed, energy system, and I think, not to get too far afield, but I think in many industries we're moving from very centralized to peer-to-peer and distributed, and so I think that's very interesting. And when you start talking to them, you realize you thought that the utilities were sort of scared of this and all the upgrades that were going to have to happen and the rollout. And then you realize that, again, it's a huge opportunity for them, right? But I do think in our role, we do the technical assistance as we've talked about, but then we also do a lot of convening, facilitating, as I was saying, educating, providing benchmarks. And it's not that we have all the information. We only have about 25 people in the joint office, although we are heading towards 50, and I never lose the opportunity to encourage people to go to our website if you're looking for a job. There's about 20 jobs there. But in that convening role, whether it's within government, with DOT, DOE, EPA, the White House, HUD, or whether it's outside with utilities and private companies, we're constantly trying to find innovative solutions or talk to people that have already done something really great. I mean, that's the easiest thing. And then elevate that case study nationally. We've been putting out a webinar a week, and actually yesterday we did one on contracting and procurement. And we bring in real cities or counties or states to talk about what they're actually doing and how it played out, the mistakes they made and the successes. Because we need to learn as fast as possible. And then just to close, I'll just say that that's one of the reasons that our programs are designed as 5-year programs. So whether it's the NEVI program, with about, $900 million, almost $1 billion a year, or the CFI grant program, there's FY 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 money, and we require a new updated plan every year because everybody is learning so fast, including us.
Thank you. So you bring up some really interesting points as it relates to the business is changing, whether we're talking about energy or transportation, moving towards a more decentralized system, in some cases peer-to-peer. And so I'd love to hear from, maybe we'll start with Duncan and then Megan, about what are some of the different business models that you are bringing to bear on this really challenging transformation that we need to undertake, knowing that, I'd love to point out that we can be dazzled by the number of zeros that are on the table right now in terms of federal funding, but what we know is there aren't nearly enough zeros to accomplish what we need to, and the policy is shaped in a way to really catalyze that private investment that would be the force multiplier in this case. So whether it's mobility as a service or V2G, starting with you, Duncan, how is your business model addressing the issue differently, and where do you see some next opportunities for your business?
Sure. We're at this moment in time where the technology is actually quite good. Gabe talked about the EU. They've been running electrified transportation longer than we have. Companies like Panasonic have developed amazing battery systems, drive systems. The tech is there. I think that the biggest issues that have really inhibited adoption would be budgets and complexity. Right? Budgets are solved in part by federal funding, by tax credits, by state funding. But if you look at the quantum, even though there are a lot of zeros, it's still a small fraction of our transportation fleets broadly. So you've got to marry that up with municipal capital, private capital, all the other forms of capital, and then you've got to stitch it together with the grants. So that's a place where public-private partnerships can be very valuable. That's what we do at Highland. We effectively fund equipment that is 2 to 3 times more expensive in exchange for long-term relationships where we can take on the operating risks and deliver something that does fit within a budget. I think to comment on the second piece, complexity is a real inhibitor to growth. The first round of the Clean School Bus program had a ton of awardees, and we've talked to probably over 50% of those school districts across the U.S. And I would say the one common thread is concern over getting all the pieces right. You got to design an electrified depot, you got to buy a bunch of equipment, you've got to construct during a really short window of time, and then you've got to train a lot of people and create this reliable ecosystem. And there are systems of support that are in the process of bubbling up from the federal government, from state governments locally, but there's still this fear of new tech and how is it going to really work at 6 a.m. when you got to get that vehicle on the road, and when it's 8 degrees, and when the driver's, accustomed to a diesel engine because they've spent 30 years working with one. And so breaking those barriers down requires the bundling and packaging of about a dozen different services. And so we think at this moment in time, right, the first inning of electrification in the U.S., you actually need to solve capital, and then you need to solve complexity and give the operators comfort that there's a really durable support system sitting by their side.
Thank you. Megan?
So I agree with everything you've said. I mean, I think that's amazing, except thank you. We do have amazing technology. We are not stopping innovating. And I think that's one of the exciting pieces is knowing how much demand there still is. We are still driving our innovation, continuing to come up with new, better, making sure that all of those complexities we see, we're able to solve for. But it is about the partnership. I mean, I think it's one of the things that Panasonic has done well for so long is appreciating, yes, we've got to work closely with the states if we're going to get the amount of funding we need to make the investment. We found some incredible partners, both at the state level, but our customers, and making sure that those customers are in place early, that we can collaborate so that there is success when we bring out our product in the end. And it's figuring out how to bring more of the supply chain to North America. I mean, we recognize how difficult, how much more expensive it is for our business model if we're bringing everything over. That's where the IRA is incredibly helpful and where we are really focused on doing that. That's the only way our business model is going to survive here.
And would you say you expect your batteries to get less expensive steadily over the next 5 years?
I'm not sure. I hope so, but I know that we are going to continue to focus on safety and looking at making sure that they are cost efficient and effective. I mean, I think that's what we're hearing from the manufacturers is they want, bigger batteries that are running longer. It's what consumers want. And so we make incredible batteries. The 4680s, brand new coming to market, are an incredible battery. We're not done there. And so, yeah, I mean, we're a business model of supply and demand. The OEMs want a cheaper battery. They want it to run longer, and that's what the customers want. And so that's why we didn't say, yep, we're done. This battery's great. So, we're continuing to look at a lot of R&D to see advancements on that.
That's great.
So you talked a little bit about safety, Megan, and I'm curious, having spent 13 years on the deployment side, I ran sustainability programs for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a big multimodal transportation agency. But what I recall is, a lot of this is about change management. So you have the operators, these drivers that may have been driving diesel buses for 30 years, but then, you also have, from a safety perspective, the first responders that, jurisdiction by jurisdiction have different comfort levels with some of this technology. There have been some high-profile battery fires that have, spooked a lot of agencies and first responders. And so I'm curious, that's just an example, but who are some of those stakeholders that might be in adjacent roles? So we are all living and breathing transportation decarbonization every day, or technology innovation. But who are some of these stakeholders that might not be at the table now that we really need to reach? And if any of you have thoughts on how to best do that, please share. Maybe, Gabe, we could start with you.
I mean, I think, we're in these early days, right? And early days are always hard, whether we're building, bridges in the early 1800s, these massive bridges for the first time over from New Jersey to New York, or building the American railroad system, right? Like Henry Flagler, everything he did. These are hard times, but I'll say that there are some real issues, and I think building and zoning within cities are probably important to be the table. Emergency responders, fire departments, the planners behind the scenes that work on those issues. And, we've seen this spate of fires in New York, and I think they're often, they're often like low quality, sometimes lead acid batteries. And so good data is really important to know what's actually happening on the ground and why are certain things happening in certain places and not others, and what are the products that are lending themselves to those problems. Because we've heard about parking garages, being scared that a car is going to catch on fire, so they won't allow an EV. And I think that's, based on probably faulty data or just misinformation, right? So as much as we can at the federal level to ingest all of that data and get it back out to people in a way that's easy to understand, we're certainly focused on.
Great. How about you, Duncan?
I would say budgeters, right? Cities, companies, anyone running a fleet has a chief financial officer, a business officer, someone who has to bless a budget. And I think there's a mentality that this is really, really expensive. And there's just a need to bring those folks along, bring them, bring the information to them to help them really understand it's not super simple, but you can get money from your utility, you can get money from the federal government, your state government, and then these vehicles operate much less expensively than a diesel or counterpart. Just, you know, the power that it takes to run a school bus, 10,000 miles a year, could be a couple $1,000s versus $7,000 or $8,000 of diesel fuel. And so there's a set of operational savings that I think people just need to realize. Once you get over the hump, you actually can put money back into your city, back into curriculum. We have a superintendent who's hired an English teacher and a music teacher because he electrified his school bus fleet. And that is very cool. You know, it's small, it's a rural school district, but it's powerful in that community.
Actually, can I add one more thing based on what you were saying? I think also, it's not just safety, like just planning for these systems. There's a whole bunch of people that need to be at the table. Like you might be installing curbside charging, right, for single occupancy vehicles or for ride hailing. What about the multimodal aspects? You know, what about lighting up the curb for streeteries? What about having, you know, a spot charge for transit if that's something that's needed? So having a dig once philosophy and having an integrated approach to planning at the local level, which is where this is happening, or at the state level, but I think a lot at the local level is going to be really important. So you're not going back into the ground. Those of us that have run transportation agencies know how time intensive and cost intensive it is to put anything into concrete and to run duct banks and all of that, right? So if you're doing it, do it once.
And overbuild once.
Put a big duct bank in there, stub out for extra charging because you're putting in 10 now, but you might want 20 stalls later. Do it now. It's going to be so much less expensive.
And we do the same thing, and it drives adoption because people see, wow, this is a big, impressive, well-built site. It probably works, which is very different from the early days of public charging where you'd plug in and it's 50-50 as to whether you'd get any power out of it. You'd have to go to the next one. And so I think there's a new world that's enabled by, largely by federal government programs where you overbuild and it drives excitement, drives adoption, and you dig once.
And we have
Couldn't agree more.
And we have a 97% uptime standard. If you use the federal money.
I love it.
Well, and I think we've talked a lot about local, and I think that's the group, you know, certainly at Panasonic, there's so many groups to bring to the table, but local continues to be a big priority because there is a lot of misinformation, and maybe it's just a lack of knowledge. And so, you know, when we look at coming into a community, explaining, you know, the cleanliness, you know, the workforce, what it looks like to be an EV battery manufacturer. There's so much that's not known about that, and so, you know, we think of it, I mean, that's such a big part of our job, certainly as a leader in the industry. One, I mean, as you're saying, do it well, you know, do it right the first time so that folks come in and say, man, it was wonderful to have this industry in our community. I think, you know, as an early leader, we could ruin it for everyone if people say, God, it wasn't safe, it wasn't enjoyable, it wasn't good for the community. But going in and having folks say, wow, this is wonderful, this is a great facility. Like, I was confused. People don't understand even what manufacturing means in the US anymore. And so being able to go in and say, wow, that, I didn't realize, like, they trained me. This was a really, you know, academic job. I didn't get dirty. It wasn't dangerous. Wow, and look at all of the community building they're doing. I think that's such a role that we fully believe that we have and we're working to play, because I think all of that misinformation and confusion, because this is moving so quickly, can really damage the industry if we don't get ahead of it and have communities say, you know, it's great, the national level is important, but if communities don't want us there, we're never going to break through.
Well, and it gets back to looking more holistically, because what the administration is really doing, what we're doing in this country, is reinventing the economy around renewable energy and electrification and hydrogen and, you know, clean fuels, and that is hard. It's not easy. There was an article that came out yesterday, like, this is so hard, maybe we shouldn't do it. I'm paraphrasing. But you see these articles, and that's why I come back to, like, the amazing entrepreneurs in this country, the amazing history we have of building things and doing things and coming up with, you know, iron phosphate batteries instead of lithium. I mean, we can do anything we set our mind to. So whenever people say, oh, it's just too hard, I'm like, no. That's what this country does, is things that are too hard.
You're totally right, but you know what I really appreciate about all of your comments is we need to make this real for people, not just in terms of, you'll be living and moving around the world very differently tomorrow. It really is about, these are your jobs, this is your community, this is your air and improved air quality. And so, just being able to tell that story on a much more personal level, I think is one of the challenges we all face in our roles. We can get really into the weeds on the technical stuff and totally nerd out in our respective areas. But if we're not, in ducks and bunnies, explaining to people, all of the stakeholders that we know we need to be successful, if we can't explain it in ducks and bunnies, then we've sort of lost the moment. But, I do want to go back to what you were all talking about in terms of what I like to call the do not preclude design scenario. So we can overbuild, you can have a bigger duct bank so that you can pull more fiber or cable down the road, because we know communications will also be a really important part of this future curb. Gabe, I like that you brought that up, because it's not just about electrifying personal vehicles and giving them an opportunity to charge, but it really is about unlocking a lot of other modes of transportation that we believe we could have in the future with innovation. But all of that being said, I think the challenge when it comes to some of these cities or transportation agencies is really understanding what is that future proofing of the infrastructure? What does that look like? How big is big enough? Every DOB has different requirements as it relates to, you need this many chargers today, but you need to be ready for double that at some point down the road. And so, just from that technical assistance perspective, where Duncan, you were talking about how you talk to your customers, if each of you could wave a magic wand and really get all of these stakeholders on the same page, what is that kind of, that missing link in understanding that you think needs to be addressed first?
I'll say, I think it's the old 80-20 rule, right? Like, it's funny that I said duct banks, but I remember when we were building and rebuilding streets, not putting a duct bank in was like a huge loss down the road, right? Because once you put the duct bank in for many blocks, you can just slide the cable through. You don't need to dig it up anymore. And when you put a 7-year moratorium on a street and say you can't dig it up, that holds everything up, which you need to, because you can't be digging up your streets every year. So without getting too technical, there are probably 20% of the things on the list that are absolutely crucial, that are high return or high cost, and if you do them, very high return, right? And so what we're trying to do is identify those, and also identify the different funding streams that can be put together. Because sure, we have NEVI and CFI grants and all this stuff. And for instance, with NEVI, you can use it for workforce development, right? There's a lot of great things you can do with this money. But there's also like dozens and dozens of other funding streams that can be utilized. So if you want to build, for instance, a multimodal hub, right? A mini port authority, whatever it is that you're trying to do, there's CMAQ money, there's RAISE grants, there's SMART grants, there's a ton of other funding. But I think a common theme on this panel is it's complexity and it's education information, right? That are the potential issues. So we're learning from panels like this, like what are people saying out there? What do we need to do? And like maybe we need to have a webinar on future proofing, and maybe it's a series, and maybe it's like here's the 80-20 of what you need to do, and here's the internal fixed costs that you think about every day, but here's the internal variable costs, here's the external costs that you don't think about. And if you build that story in such a way that our stakeholders can understand it, and you give them the benchmarks and a roadmap and the formula, then they can execute on it, right? And we can bring private sector into those conversations to explain how they can help.
I think that is a brilliant idea, and hopefully many people in the room agree.
I'm stealing it from you as
webinar.
well as
Well, there
ducks
you
and
go.
bunnies.
See, we're getting it done.
I didn't
right
know about
here.
ducks and bunnies until now, so we're going to do one called Ducks and Bunnies.
Gabe hit on, right, do you put a duct bank in? I think access to power is sort of binary. Is there enough power? Does the utility have to upgrade a substation or a local feeder? And so we run into this all the time. I think for us, one of the big elephants in the room that hasn't been addressed enough yet is just how we think about our distribution system, our electric distribution system, and its ability to marry up with electrified transportation. Because we could be doubling our need for electricity, and if everyone comes home and charges their vehicles during the time when air conditioning load is the highest, you've taken a situation that's already strained. You know, we have this demand curve for power daily and then seasonally, and we're not adding base load, we're adding distributed renewables, and so we're further disrupting sort of the balance of supply and demand. The reality is most electric vehicles, whether it's, you know, an Audi in your garage or it's a fleet of electrified garbage trucks, there's a good amount of flexibility on when they can charge. And so I think there's an exercise that we all need to close a gap on, which is working with the reality of the power you have locally, and then if you can only draw a certain amount during periods of time, create the communications, the networking, and the systems with the technology backbone that can actually achieve that outcome. We charge fleets of school buses and we draw 5 megawatts of power overnight because there's not a lot of demand for power and there are wind farms that are running nearby. And so that is a perfect example of you can charge when power is abundant and clean, and avoid charging when it's all you know, fossil fuel generated. And the utilities don't have the systems and the processes to set up those rate tariffs yet. But I bet you.
Well, it is being worked on, and there's some great examples out there. We're trying to get a handle on all of that. But that also speaks to bidirectional charging, right? Like some school buses can do it, some can't. A Chevy Bolt can do it. My car automatically charges off-peak at the lowest rate at night, right? It's set up that way. So this is where technology comes in. Like, technology is so important in this realm, because if we have all the school buses, you know, basically running like 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and charging at night, they can be sending energy back to the grid at peak. So when California, you know, 3% of the time is hitting their max in the summer, they can be using the school bus fleet, so they don't have to put more capital into building out the grid, right? And I talked to the PG&E, you know, we talked about this. They're excited about this opportunity, but maybe you have a thought.
We don't look at the crystal ball much as a business. I think what we really try to think about is, you know, as a 100-year-old company, we are an innovative company that's willing to learn and adapt. And I think that's one of the places that Panasonic really does well, is we've taken all of our lessons learned. We're willing to be vocal about it. You know, our leadership is talking and continuing to learn, because this is moving so quickly. And, you know, we're always trying to figure out what's next, where are we going? But I think the healthiest thing that we think for our company is to continue to look at where do we need to see improvements and how do we quickly adjust and make those, because we are moving so quickly. And if we become the type of, you know, 100-year-old company that says, we've been doing this, we do it really well, so that's it, then we're gonna have real problems in this industry. And I think, you know, we have been trying to look back and learn, and then be vocal, and then talk about it, and share it publicly to say, all right, we've had a facility here since 2015. Here are all the things that we learned that were really difficult, and we're gonna make improvements as we move into our next facility. And everyone else out there should learn from us and do this so that we're all on the same page. You know, we're not gatekeeping these learnings. And I think that's one of the most important things that we see, and that we think, you know, from all of us, that's what we can do. Is it's great to look ahead. It's great to try to predict what we need. It's also really important to see where we are, what the challenges are, and work to solve those really quickly right now, so that we don't get stuck in some of these processes that aren't working.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we're running out of time, but what I really think is an important takeaway from this last exchange is the digitalization of the industry needs to be happening in parallel to some of this deployment of hardware. And it needs to be done in a way where these things can communicate with one another. So we need open data standards, we need data sharing, we really need some of these protocols to be ironed out up front to really get the most out of the transition, but then also to shrink that requirement. So if we're better using our fleets, if we have better insight into when some of these fleets should be charging or which ones need a charge, and really be able to have that overlay, I think that's where ultimately we'll get more efficient. I think that focus on efficiency first as we're going into the transition is really critical, because then we won't need to do a like-for-like replacement and have all of these big fleets that might not be getting utilized most efficiently. But with that, I want to thank our panel. I think this has been a really, really interesting discussion, and thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.